I think moving from Taiwan at around 11 was definitely a big cultural shock. I still feel the impact of that to me even now as an adult, like towards my late 20s. I think one of the things I realized was it was a lot harder to find common things, especially when you were kids coming over. The day-to-day of going to school, obviously, besides having really different language barriers, when you first started, it's very difficult to connect with friends. There were a few things that was very universal, like Pokemon, which transcended across culture. And the other thing that transcended culture is a love for food. And so I had this kid, George, and he introduced me to a lot of Greek food that I've never experienced. Baklava, which is like this pastry sweet. He was like, oh, my mom will make this. And if you can get your mom to make the dumpling that was in your lunchbox. And this was like, I've had this dumpling just every day in, day out, because my mom's kind of single parent here. I was struggling. I didn't get to pick what we get to eat. And so it was one way for me to diversify my lunchbox back throughout school. And I loved it so much. And we made friends, like, so yeah, it was definitely a massive shock. But then there was different things I realized over time. Once my language was good enough, I was able to connect through Pokemon cards, foods, and sports, playing handball or something like that. So that was great.
You mentioned language several times. Isn't there a story concerning Harry Potter?
Yeah. So when I came to Australia, I knew how to speak Hokkien, I knew how to speak Mandarin, but my English was non-existent in the sense that, yeah, I've done a few English classes back in primary school, but they just teach you saying, my name is Vincent and I am 11 years old, 12 years old. The grammar was really difficult. And I really struggled because everyone was telling us to learn. You can't rely on English, Chinese. You got to let that go and you just got to immerse yourself. And the magical source that we found was that I actually have a love for reading ever since I was young. And at the time, Harry Potter was massive growing up for us. And so when I left, J.K. Rowling just released up to the Goblet of Fire, and that get translated to Mandarin, which usually take 1 to 2 years before the books get released. And so here I am, just moved to Australia, and the Order of Phoenix, which is the next book, got released in English first. It will take another year or two before the Chinese comes out. And so my mum was like, I will only buy you the book in English. And that became a massive driver for me to learn to read, because I wanted to find out what happens next after, spoiler alert, like Cedric Diggory got killed by Voldemort and the Voldemort's back. It's such a big cliffhanger that I had to just push through. And that was what actually got me started to read, and to actually another discussion point with my friends back at school.
I imagine that being Asian as well, you must have done really well in school at the time.
Yeah, I think coming here, I really struggled. I think a huge part being that English not being your language, it's really hard to understand any of the tests and what they're trying to ask you. I was virtually just looking at the test paper in front of me, and every single question that had a blank answer, I know I would struggle. So I would just leave it blank. But anything that comes with some sort of multiple choice or some sort of a thing that I could game, I would approach it probabilistically.
Wasn't the turning point when you were in grade 8? What's the story there?
Growing up in Chinese culture, we've had this proverb, we spoke about this in Chinese, which is 少壮不努力，老大徒伤悲. If you don't work hard when you're young and you just played like all your life away, then you're going to be, I guess, like very sad and miserable when you become older, because you haven't saved, you haven't invested and built yourself towards something. And so there was kind of these moments where I sit down, and it was a massive sense of like, I didn't want to let my parents down. And that became a massive driver throughout a huge part of my life of why, as well as a sense of I don't want to be, how the proverb described me when I get older, which is sad and miserable and a failure in some way. I guess at the time created the association and the story, because I guess that's what my parents believe. That's what a lot of people around me believe. All the aunties and the grandma believe was you got to do well at school and you got to do well at this kind of thing to succeed. And so I sat down at year 8 and I realized is that I needed to really commit myself. Otherwise, I wouldn't have a successful life. Like I would live a very miserable and unhappy life. The other thing to kind of paint a bit of picture on is when I first came over, it was towards the end of my primary school years. In Australia, we kind of have the culture of where it doesn't really matter where you go for primary school. It's more about creativity and fun and just learning and getting that good basic foundation of language and arithmetic and creativity. But then when you get to high school, this is where like things start to, you're kind of working towards, I guess, a university degree. Like this is how a lot of kind of parents used to think of it. And when I came at a time where everyone's preparing for the entrance exam into the these like selective prestigious high school, or some people being preparing their kids for school application for years to come. And the really good school, really selective. Yeah, because I just got here, I had no network, I had no language ability, I couldn't get into any good schools. So I ended up at this school, which was definitely a little rough around the edges. It was an all boys school with a lot of rugby and boy culture that I think my parents definitely didn't like, but it was better than the other alternatives that they think at the time. And so it was kind of also a conversation of, hey, you could look at a transfer, but you really need to pick up your grades. And so, yeah, I sat down and I had this chat with myself. The internal dialogue was, if I don't pick it up, then I'm going to be a dropkick, which is an Australian slang. It just means that you're going to be on the street. You're going to be useless on the street. And so I really worked hard that year, and it was incredible how things flipped around. I remember I got 17% on a test. Like, how do you get 17% on a test? It was for German, and I just did not care. And I remember flipping around, I got 97% in year 8. Like, it was such a drastic change. I was quite shocked at like what I could do at the time as well when I applied myself. Funny enough, 97% German earned you second place. I have this Greek friend who I happen to be lifelong friends with now, Luke, and he got 99.
I love that you still remember the numbers.
I remember because I worked so damn hard. Like, a 13-year-old, you have the discipline to stick with something for a whole year. And you're like, what? I only got second. Someone beat me. But yeah, anyway, Luke is that friend. And yeah, it was a crazy year. And then towards the end of it, I applied at different places. And I actually got offers to go into a few of these selective schools, and also a private school who's offered me a scholarship.
And what was the story behind you doing electrical engineering at the University of New South Wales? Was it something that your parents encouraged you to do or not?
All throughout high school, I think this pattern of thinking I'm a failure, thinking I'm a dropkick, and then having to like sit myself down and really pull through with success has been kind of the driving force of how hard I work and all those things, lead to the point where I think I was definitely very burnt out multiple times over and over, leading up to kind of the final year of taking my test and deciding what to do for university and stuff like that. Obviously, my mom and I had another conversation. My mom definitely brought us up with a view of what success looked like. For example, it would be like, wow, look at so-and-so's son. They are a doctor. Wow, look at your cousin. She's doing medicine at Brown. Oh, wow, that person's a lawyer, and her partner is also a lawyer too. That's been kind of ingrained and stuff. So there was a few things like, law, med, being the obvious ones. Everyone gets lost throughout their high school years. You will also go to your parents and be like, I'm not sure what I should do. They're like, oh, what do you think about medicine? What do you think about law? I guess you can consider dentists too. These things will be presented, and that would kind of be the only thing you get presented with. And then the stretch goal will be like pilots or like pharmacists, or like, oh, you can do medical science too. And then that would be a transition. I guess that's why a lot of Asian friends grew up to be lawyers and doctors.
You're not missing much.
I mean, I'm speaking to one now. So yeah, so essentially what led up to that was towards the final year, I was really burnt out. And I think because I've grinded so many years to try and keep my marks up. The reason I need to do that was because I was on a scholarship. And if I let it drop, the school could rescind the scholarship, which means I can't afford to be here. And I have to say goodbye to my friends, and I might have to go back to a different school where I could get pushed around or something like that, right? So I guess it was a lot of pressure that I put on myself. Like, it was almost like I needed to do this to survive. At least that's what I told myself. I cannot fail. It was an option. And yeah, so I think when I got to the final year, I knew the school couldn't really find me anymore. I just knew they wouldn't do that. It's the last year. They've invested all these years in scholarship. They're trying to get me to contribute, right? And I was so burnt out at this point. I was jigging classes. I wasn't rocking up. I was just wanted to run away in some way. As I sit on my final exams, I did decently well, but yeah, I didn't bother to work for my net entrance exam, and I missed subjects like law and all those kind of stuff by a fraction of a percent or something, which means like path to entry wasn't a direct one. It would have to be something that I had to work around. So I actually didn't pick engineering. Funny enough, it was one of these Asian overachiever things. So I picked the next highest subject that's on the requirement list, if that makes sense. So these are done by supply and demand. So obviously med and law being so competed against have some of the highest requirement entry mark in terms of like where you need to lie on the bell curve distribution across the country. I missed it by a little bit. And so I moved down the next thing on the bell curve. which is commerce. Funny enough, a lot of people want to do commerce. But then I looked at commerce, I feel, oh, I don't feel that's enough. So I added a commerce engineering into my degree. And so I'm going to add that in there and pick up a 5.5 year minimal commitment for whatever reason. Throughout first year of uni, I think my burnout didn't go away after the break. It just worsened. And so I pretty much flunked a lot of the subjects. I started to think about why am I doing this? I kind of came to the realization like nothing they teach me isn't something I couldn't learn somewhere else. And so I dropped commerce and I stuck with engineering. But then with engineering, you have to specialize. And there was so many specialties that I didn't know which one to pick. How I ended up in electrical engineering was around 2016, Disney launched their first movie, which was Iron Man. And I loved Robert Downey Jr.'s enactment of Iron Man 1 so much. I even Googled this answer, I remember, and read it, and people talk about like, oh, doing mechatronics, but then ultimately it's a subset of electrical. So doing that is great. And that is exactly how I made my university specialization decisions that continue the rest of my career. I actually flunked first year. I was barely passing. And the similar notion of if I don't work hard when I'm young, I'm going to become on the street and a failure and a dropkick when I'm older. Like I realized I wasn't figuring it out. I could either just take a break, like leave and quit, or I just need to stuck it out and then do what I did in year 8, and the story I keep telling myself like, hey, you did it in year 8, you did it in year 12. If you don't do it now, everything you've worked for would have been wasted for nothing. So I set myself an arbitrary goal of I want to get first class honors, which is the highest tier that you can kind of graduate with. On the bus to uni every morning, I would put my music on and I would play these motivation soundtrack, like Eric Thompson, the hip hop preacher, Tony Robbins, and all these people about not quitting, about failure is not an option, about how soft our generation has become and we gotta keep pushing, and like how we're so privileged. And yeah, so that was the mentality of driving myself. But I eventually made it. I eventually graduated with first class honors. Yeah.
Do you feel like some part of that question was answered when you started CodeCreate and you were teaching kids how to build games like Minecraft?
Yeah. This is a pattern of my life. So towards the final year of something, it's when you think about like, oh, I'm so close, but then you start to think about I should quit. So one of the biggest frustration of me going through university, well, beside from like not knowing my why, and I hated all the exams. Anyone who's gone through university or who are going through it now will know that the success metrics of a university for all of it, it's like we get a good job, a good career experience, a good internship experience on the other side. And so a year into university, every single year I would apply for internships and I would apply for work experiences that are relevant in the field. I will go to application, I'll go to career council, and I like trying to write a cover letter. I've done 50, 100 easily per semester. It gets to a point where it's so hard because I'm trying to write something that tells them how passionate I am. And that's just not really true. At this point in my life, I've transitioned from all the motivational speakers into thinkers and entrepreneurs, like people who transformed something in some way. One of the biggest influences was Steve Jobs at the time. I think it was because iPhone just came out towards that period of time, as well as iPad. I didn't understood what he did to Apple and the transformation that he went through, but I could see the product that he created and the impact that's had and the desire of everyone wanting an iPhone when it came out. Like it was revolutionary compared to what was before was the BlackBerry with lots of buttons. I loved it and looked up to him having really original thoughts and not conforming to people saying, we want longer battery life, we want more buttons. And so in many ways, I was really inspired by that. And one of the things he said was, when you realize that the world are made up of people no better than you, they're just people, same as you've gone through the same struggle that you were doing now, you start to learn that you can shape it, you can change it, you can mold it and influence it. And that really made an impact on me. And so for the very first time in my life at around 2021, I set myself down during the summer break and I go, if nothing matters, and if you just don't care about the opinion of other people, just for once in your life, and you just think about doing what you're good at and what you love, what would that be? And the answer I came up with was there was parts of engineering that I loved. Learning and building new tech was very, very exciting for me. It was frustrating in the process, but when you see something work, you feel like you gain this superpower, this sense of empowerment, this excitement that comes with it. So that was one. And two was I knew I loved kids. Growing up, I've always taken care of baby cousins and second cousins, and I would baby kids hours on end, and the mom would love me. And then the last thing I realized was I really like to teach. I've been tutoring kids all throughout my life, and that's when I find the most interesting. I think it was one of the things that I think I would do this even if I'm not paid. I read about this Ikigai framework that people were talking about at the time. The other part of it was I've also taught at university, and towards the end, I was running a lot of first year electrical engineering and mechatronics students who have to learn basic elect circuits and stuff. So I was running the practical components. I really enjoy teaching because it's an element of I'm learning, but then I'm also sharing that knowledge, and also I can really relate to them. So I was really scared by my answer because my answer leads me to become a teacher. That was so out of grain. Like, teacher was not an option on my parents' successful. The guy I was doing my thesis with, he happened to be the head of school. And so he actually offered, do you want to stay at university? And then you could do your PhD and keep teaching as well. Because it's rare for him to find academic people who also enjoy teaching. My obvious gut answer is no, because I'm done with uni at that point. Essentially, yeah, I actually approached some schools to look at what it looks like to be a teacher. And I also approached university, so I had to do another year of master's in teaching, which turned me off massively. And then I also spoke to a few schools. They told me what the starting role and salary and progression would look like. I just trying to learn about the career. And I think because I grew up poor in comparison to the Australians here, as well as your mom will talk about, oh, be like, wow, he's a doctor, he makes $400,000 a year or something, he's a specialist. And so what I ended up decided was, why don't I try to create a program and tutor kids and teach them how to code? At the time, I think STEM, like engineering and science, and the rise of these tech companies, Facebook, Shopify, Netflix was growing rapidly, become really, really big. And the parents could see that. And so the pitch to the parents was like, hey, let me tutor your kids. I'm running these classes. If your kids, you think reading about English is important, I think the future world is going to rely on tech, everything's built on software. And so you want to teach your kids how to like think about engineering and then think about how to read code. And then the pitch to kids, and it's in reverse, that favorite computer game that you've always wanted to play and you wish you could just modify it or be able to hack it and give yourself a real superpower, I'll teach you how to make that. So that was a pitch. And so I started teaching and tutoring kids how to code. And then, yeah, I ended up having like 3 to 4 kids who were crazy enough to say yes and sign up with me. And that was how the first class started.
And then from there, the second cohort just exploded, right? From 3 to 4 to 86.
Yeah, so unexpectedly, the way we went in was like I went to some of the schools and I speak with friends and family and stuff, and I got a few kids who started, and we started teaching it out of this particular school because they have the computers, they have all those things, and I couldn't afford computers at the time. I didn't have the upfront capital to go in. The second semester, I think, we went back, and I remember the school called me up and was like, hey, Vincent, we need to have a chat. I was a little bit worried because I was like, what's going on? It was kids, right, in a school, and you have to be really professional and careful. And I was 21. I was like, anyway, they were like, hey, so good news. We have 86 kids who signed up. They're starting next week. You good to go? And at this point, I was like, oh, yeah. No worries. Like, that's my like default response. It just came out straight away. Like, yeah, no worries. Yeah, next week. Yeah, we'll be here. All good. We'll sort it out. So yeah. So we're thinking of giving you 3 classrooms because they can't all fit, and then we'll figure out the computers and all that kind of stuff, and blah, blah, blah. The school was actually a very progressive school. So they were actually like supporting me. And in some way, the teachers, the principal at the time was kind of mentoring me a little bit throughout how to navigate this partnership with the school, which became valuable learnings I was able to replicate over and over again later on. And so I went away, it hit me, 86 kids. That's 4 classes of kids. And I sometimes already struggle with behaviors. 4 kids get really excited. They're like running around. Like, what would this look like 20 times bigger? Like I was shocked. So I knew I needed help. And long story short was I went back to the uni. I spent years with these guys and I know who was really intelligent and also very socially great with other people, with parents, with kids, all that kind of stuff. When I first teaching that class, I could charge $20 a kid. And suddenly I make $80 an hour. And so it changes the game. I was really incentivized because for once, the financial was aligned with what I love to do. And that became really empowering. It took me to a whole new level of performance that I couldn't get before by just pushing. They know I've been teaching kids code. And so I was like, hey guys, so the school came back. I got 86 kids and I don't think I can teach all of them. So what if I pay each of you $50 an hour and I'll give you guys a call and come teach kids with me? So that's how it kind of got started. So next weekend, I brought a bunch of my friends all on my payroll. We split up the class and it was very chaotic. It was very crazy and it was a lot of kids. At some point, about like a couple of weeks in, the teacher came in, like one of the principal and teacher came in, like, Vincent, I want to check in. How are you doing? I was like, yeah, I think I'm good. How do you think I'm doing? Well, she's like, look, I think you're doing amazing because the kids are so excited, which equates to chaos. And like the parents are talking about it, having really good feedback to me. I'm hearing all the great things. So just whatever you're doing, you keep it up. And so out of that, I think I learned a few really important lessons. I realized why the class grew from 4 to 86. It was essentially like referral, right? How referral works. This is how like Airbnb grew. This is how Dropbox grew. This is how I guess Zoom grew. I realized that the parents and the kids were referring each other. It also like gave me a taste of what compounding growth looks like and feels. And I learned like referral works really well, and it only works really by inviting their friends and their peers. It makes the experiences better. And that has to be the foundation of referral, as opposed to like a lot of people in like product and growth now at work, they go like, oh yeah, we should add an invite your friend button here and then just see what happens. Right? Like it was like a throw a dart in the dark, as opposed to like, thinking about that. The second thing I learned was I got a taste of entrepreneurship. I guess I didn't know it was called entrepreneurship at the time. Got a taste of and learned was to no longer be on a paycheck. I started to learn the impact of how on one hand, I was packing shelves. I was like 17 to 24. Tutoring was 30, maybe 40 at university. But then now with 86 kids, I hired my friend. The net revenue per hour was 1,600 and something. And if I pay each of my friend $50, they're super happy by the way. They're excited, they're ecstatic, they got paid that much. I make easily over 1,000 something a week, just per hour class. And that changed my mind. I was like, wow, how many hours of one-on-one math do I have to grind versus doing this? So it started to change the way I think about things.
You said you weren't on a paycheck, but weren't you working for Suncorp as well?
Yes. So this whole thing started towards the final year of my university because I wanted to quit, and it was the only way to keep me engaged and not quit. And my thesis supervisor, the head of school at the time, and he knew I was running this thing. He was fascinated. He got kids himself. He says, this is great. I will put my kid in it 100%. And he's like, hey, Vincent, have you done your internship yet? I was like, no, I've been too busy like figuring out how to write courses and teaching kids. And he's like, you need an internship to graduate. I was like, crap. And this was like toward the end of the year. And I've had very bad experiences applying for internships. And my dread started to come in. I remember this, like my heart sank. I was like, crap. If I don't get one, I wouldn't be counted as a graduate. And I was so done with university, I need to get out. I remember I went on all the grad websites. Like everyone's like, oh, come back next year. Or you got to be in the penultimate year. And I was like, I'm in my final year and I've way past everybody's application period. And I go around my year group, I ask everybody, they've all applied. And I really started to panic. Luckily, I scoured the web and I found these like 3 opportunities opened up. And so I was like, well, okay, it's 3 CV instead of 50, but I'll do 3. I actually applied at 3 places. I got offer back at all 3. So the strike rate is completely different. I realized what I changed was at the top of my CV, every time people always put their marks, and maybe what they're doing for their thesis, and then maybe volunteering or some sort of other work experience, right? But instead of doing that, I was like, okay, I'll put my mark at the top. And then the second thing is I'll put my thesis too. And then the last thing I put down, I built a business that made this much in the first year and this year. And then I employed a team of 4 people at the time or something. And everyone wanted to have a conversation. It was interesting. And now I'm looking back on hiring. Yeah, if I see someone like that, 100%, I'd be interested. I went through all 3 different companies' interviews, and one company was Suncorp. And for people who don't know, it was one of the top 10 publicly listed bank and financial service company in Australia. It was also the biggest insurance company. It is the biggest insurance company still, I think, in Australia, Oceanic, and some part of the Pacific region. And then the second company was this thing called Imagination Tech. They're essentially a subcontractor for Apple, and they design about 10 to 15% of all the iOS chips at the time. It was a highly technical role. And then the last role was in renewable energy space. They make solar panel like accessible to everyday homeowners, and then they figure out a way to reduce their electricity bill through installing those. They all made an offer, and that startup company was growing so fast. I remember reading up about it. It more than 4 or 5x its revenue in 1 year. And it was only a team of 20 something people. But ultimately, I think some of that Asian upbringing still ingrained in me. And so I chose Suncorp because it was the company that I can walk down the street and my mom could go, is that where you work? You can point at a logo on a big billboard somewhere. I'll be like, oh yeah, that's where I work. So yeah, that's what I picked up as an internship. And I still ran the coding courses and stuff I had as a side hustle. And obviously continue until next year. I've completed my requirements. That means I'm graduating. I need to go find a full-time job. What I was doing was not considered a full-time job. It was tutoring, right? My parents think it's tutoring. It's like you're just tutoring maths and stuff to make a bit of pocket money. So at the time, I was looking at the 3 roles that I described. Obviously, one was very technical. And I think throughout my experience, I knew I wasn't going to be the best at it. And then the startup role, I think in hindsight, I would have loved to have taken that, but I was so culturally washed to go to a bigger company, which is what I did.
I'm guessing you didn't know anyone in the startup world at the time as well.
I don't think startup was a thing in any other part of the world at the time, with the exception of Silicon Valley. There was also a bit of a quirky stigma around it. What if it doesn't work out? What if you fail? Then again, this narrative, you work so hard for all your university and then you have this one shot to get your foot in the door. You're giving up all that to go and start something. Yeah, so there was a lot of fear and stigma around it. Ultimately, I went into Suncorp. I was astounded by some of the people I met in there, in the sense of like they were young and hungry and ambitious people who were trying to make their way up the ladder. There were also people who'd been there for 20 plus years. They openly say, I was like, oh yeah, I'm just waiting to get retired and then I can't change. If I change, then I don't get this big retirement payout because of how long I've been in the company. And I was just like, well, good for you, but I don't think that's how I want to spend my 20s. That's not how I want to spend my life. My manager at the time, his name was Michael Jordan, we call him MJ. He was like, hey, Vincent, so we really like your work and blah, blah. And we developed this software thing that was kind of cool. We want to offer you a grad position. And my other kind of work friend at the time also got offered. And we had a lot of fun playing a lot of ping pong together during the day. So I was like, oh, this could be really fun. But then they were like, oh, but you have to come in full time. And this is where I stopped. And I thought of how the guy spent 20 something years at this place. And I could see how comfortable it was and how easy it was to do that. I think there's this sense of adventure in me that didn't want to. I was like, I don't think I want to work here full time. Would you consider a contractor role where I can come in on flexible days? And they knew I had this business on the side I was running, because during the interview, a lot of them was like, why do you want to apply here? I think in some way, like I can see looking back on it now, in some way they're, oh, I wish I had a business that I can run as free. So he was like, oh, are you negotiating with me? Yeah, I guess I am. I'm just asking. I think one thing you learn from pitching for clients at school is like, you don't ask, you don't get, right? And then they're like, okay, so are you telling me if you don't get this flexible arrangement, you wouldn't accept the offer and you will walk away? I kind of like disconnected from that a little bit. I was like, yeah, I would have to really consider it. And he's like, okay, cool. And then the meeting ended there. He's like, let me think about it. Let me go and like have a chat with people. And then we came back a week later and he goes, are you sure you wouldn't take the grad role? Are you sure you wouldn't consider it? Because that's what we offer. Like, it's very uncommon. We don't really do that for other people. Are you sure about that? And I sat there, thought about it. I was, yeah, I think that's what I would like. I still like the flexible role. I was like, okay, cool. And then we stood up and then I stood up. I don't know why he stood up. So we stood up and then we shook hands. And then he's like, okay, well, yeah, we usually just do the grad role. We're about to walk out. And I thought, okay, all right. I was kind of like coming to terms with it. And then he's like, hey, Vincent, hold on a second. He grabbed me. He's like, yeah. So I spoke with his manager and everybody and like, yeah, we can offer you the contract role and so on and so forth. And then I was like, oh, and then I was a massive smile. So that's how that started. I went in as a data engineer. Very quickly, I realized I could get the work done in a day and a half. So that's how I juggled the two until I feel I was not spending my life wisely by staying there any longer, because I wasn't getting anything out of it aside from just having a level of comfort that, and also something to show my parents that I'm putting a suit on, I'm heading out at 8 a.m. and catching the work bus like everybody, and I have a work pass on.
I love that you said, if you don't ask, you don't get. I feel everyone is saying this to me. I just interviewed someone 2 days ago and she said the exact same thing. So did you ask because there were two brothers, right, who came to you and wanted to fund your next startup, Cody? What's the story behind that?
I didn't ask for that. I think in some ways it's the right mentality, because I built CodeCreate, which is morphed parts of it into Cody. I built that on the premise of I need to build a profitable business, otherwise I can pay myself. And so first of all, the idea of startup still was unfamiliar to me. Secondly, so the idea of raising money was even less familiar for me. And in fact, I was brought up not to use credit card, not to take debt, not to take money from people. It became kind of really nice, because when you start a business and go through this journey and you're working sometimes like really hard and really long hours, your friend doesn't understand. They'd be like, oh, we're asking him to come out on Sunday, but he just always tells us he's busy, right? So I'm trying to prepare for this next course for like, now we've got over 100 kids a week rotating through. That's a lot of kids. That's thousands of kids a year. I want to go build that. And I'm also really excited. It'll be nice when I go out at 11. So I'll be at a party till 11. I'll be like, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm a bit awkward at parties. All right, guys, I'm going to go home. I'm tired. I'm going to go home early. And then I just go back and jump on my computer and start writing courses and stuff. But yeah, so I bumped into Ben and Toby, who was these two brothers. One was startup background, the other one from investment banking background at a pretty high level. And so they both kind of left their jobs and they decided, okay, we want to start working with young founders and startups. And so they started a small VC fund for an accelerator fund, funding startups and bring them into a community to work together. My friend told me about it because he got funded by them. He made the introduction. I had a chat with them. And then toward the end of the chat, I kind of told them my story up to that point and how I taught at the school and stuff like that. Toward the end of that point, they were like, yeah, we'd like to fund you to start something. And they were like, look, CodeCreate is a great business, but it's a cash cow business. They wanted to see something more technical. They want to see something technological. And they knew I was capable enough to code. They wanted me to build something that is much more scalable and much more technical. And at the same time, I was also at a point where CodeCreate was doing 6 figures a year. I didn't really know how to take it any further. The operation was very challenging for someone who's never operated a single thing in their life. You're essentially trying to run a factory, but with more chaos because you're not dealing with machines, you're dealing with kids who are full of creativity and full of energy, and parents who are very protective of their kids and then want them to do well. And yeah, so that was how that started. I was tired. I've been working really hard ever since I've been at school, all the way up to university. And instead of taking a break somewhere after or go traveling or do something, I jumped straight into building a business and then also working pretty much like 3 to 4 days a week at a job that other people would usually consider that to be their grad full-time role. It was intense and I was tired. But then I was like, oh, this opportunity probably only came right now, and I don't know if it's going to be there in the future. And so ultimately, I decided to took it for the learning. I saw it as a degree, a way to learn that I wouldn't otherwise have gotten anywhere.
The premise of Cody is basically it's an edtech platform for developers to learn how to code. And it's a bit like Lambda school, isn't it? They inspire you.
I was really passionate about education. I bumped into my co-founder at the time, Mitch. He was technical, but he was also passionate in the education space. So we had a few coffees and we decided like, hey, I'm getting funded. Why don't you come on and be my co-founder? Because that was the word that was thrown around. It's like, how do you find a co-founder? I was like, why don't you come and be my co-founder? I was like, just got married like that, like it was crazy. I didn't know how to phrase it at the time, but the way I phrase it now, and this is still a deep belief that I have and something I'm really passionate about, is that intelligence are equally distributed across the world. The opportunities are not. That was a big reflection of how I grew up in the sense of when I was in Taiwan, there were a lot more kids who were a lot more intelligent than me. But I got lucky, I get to come and they didn't get the same opportunity I had. And now our lives are drastically different. I'm a lot more privileged than they are, but we came from the same place. And so, yeah, we kind of saw that. And that's when Lambda School first started. It was like a year in, and they were doing essentially what a lot of coding boot camps were doing, like General Assembly, where they were teaching people to code and retransitioning them from a non-technical background into becoming a software engineer. And that was a massive growing job market at the time. I think it still is. And it was so competed against that it was paid like 6-figure plus for some of the exit jobs. And that was a lot of money at the time. That's still a lot of money now for sure. One of the big problems with these coding bootcamp, and I guess university as well, is that you take a loan or they charge you upfront without guaranteeing you the success of what you do afterwards. And so Lambda School did the thing where like, we will teach you and we'll charge you nothing upfront until you get hired. And the way they do that is legally called something an income share agreement, an ISA, where once you get paid, essentially you start to be able to repay that loan. And then you pay a percentage of your salary up to a certain amount. We really like that because we were obviously for uni students, and for us to want to retransition, that seems like a very attractive option. So we decided we want to solve that problem. And we started to speak to a lot of people, and we realized that one of the biggest problems students have is getting a job. And so we wanted to create that and build that. And we had a lot of tough lessons, because I think building CodeCreate is something that's a lot more shorter term. Like you could put something in and you can see an outcome immediately. The way the outcome is measured is like you measure revenue, one of the key drivers of a business. But then when you start to build something like this, you're thinking years into the future. You're thinking like a year down the track. How do I validate? How do I build this? And then you have to figure out incrementally then how do you ship things incrementally that then like leads you to the outcome. So it requires a very different like mindset of thinking. You need to have a much longer term and then be able to then break that down into smaller pieces of things that.
And Australia didn't have the equivalent of it, ISA, right?
We didn't do it through ISA. We were trying to do it through recruiter fees because we know nothing about law, and we thought paying for lawyers at the time was super expensive and we couldn't afford it. So we decided to do it through different model. We're trying to do recruiter fees, or we're trying to go speak to tech companies who would hire these students. I think irrespective of how we charge, we knew it was important that we get people hired. That was the success metric that we were trying to do. So that was how the business started. We didn't end well. Me and Mitch reflected on this later on. We weren't aligned on the same thing, whether it was for the business or for our life's outcome, how we see we want to live our lives. Because when you take on a business, it's like a marriage, right? It becomes a huge part of your life, and you both need to have a strong why of why you're doing it. So later on, Mitch obviously left after 6 months. He had to change of mind, and he realized that he wanted to go be a software engineer. And I think from doing the business, he knew like, wow, it pays a lot. And also the business was going through a tough time. We were very inexperienced and we didn't know how to spend the investors' money wisely. And we also burned a lot of cash. Plus, I also front up a lot of the profits from CodeCreate that I've like accumulated over the years. So we actually burned over 6 figures of money for a 24-year-old and a 22-year-old. It's a crazy amount of money to burn in 6 months. So that didn't go well. And the other thing we learned was it was a really hard market because the students that we wanted to reach, the different stakeholders like both education company has, right? Like the student we wanted, they aren't always aware that these kind of coding bootcamp was an option for them. So if your customer aren't aware of the problem, it becomes a much more difficult problem to have to work out. I suppose that they're aware of it and you know how to find them, because you have to re-educate them on the whole thing and gain that trust for them to commit 6 months, a year of learning with you in some way. And then we were trying to go for students, which was wrong because we were trying to change the perspective, because we both came out of university and we're like, nah, this is wrong. And so we're trying to go back to university students and try and tell them don't go into the big company. You need to come and do this, come and do our course, and we'll connect you with hot startup at the time. So they were startup we were talking to that were hiring Canva, for example, which later become massive.